Hi folks, I'm Mike Medea, Head of Education Programs at the American Philosophical Society. If you haven't joined us before for our career chats, that's okay. If you have, thanks for being part of our community. If you need a quick introduction to the APS though, be sure to check out our website or follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So, as you might know, we're here to discuss the many careers offered by an organization like the APS. As a museum, research library, archive, and membership society, we have great staff who do work ranging from administration to publications. Career Chats showcases these staff members and introduces you to careers you might not have considered before. I ask these staff members a series of questions during this interview. If you've seen the page for the series and have a question about a certain career though, be sure to submit it. We'd love to hear from you. Today on Career Chats, I'm here with Dr. Jenni Bolt, Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow, shorter known as a Curator at the APS. Hi Jenni, how you doing today?
Good, thanks.
Shall we just jump right in? All right, so could you repeat your name and title and tell us a little bit more about you?
Sure, so I'm Jenni Bolt. I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow at the American Philosophical Society, which is a long way of saying I have a sort of a 2-year funded position at the APS where I act as the museum curator. I have my bachelor's degree in history and art history from Michigan State University, and I did my master's and my PhD in American Studies at William & Mary in Virginia. I've previously worked at the Colonial Williamsburg Art Museums as a curatorial fellow. I worked in costume one summer at Colonial Williamsburg as an interpreter, and I've spent time giving tours at William & Mary's historic campus, spent a year as a graduate assistant at the Mariners Museum Library, and have interned as an undergraduate at the Michigan State University Museum, at the Michigan History Museum, and at the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame and Historical Center.
I didn't know that last one, so that's a good one to know. Which I think is really great because it's kind of rare, or seemingly rare, for a curator or somebody kind of moving into the curator position to have all of that experience with education. It's so, like, I know we've talked a lot about your kind of like front lines experience, especially at Colonial Williamsburg. So it's great to have that understanding of what visitors kind of expect and see at exhibitions. So that's great. So what do you do and how do you kind of explain that work to your friends or family?
Yeah, so I generally say that my primary sort of most public facing, most obvious part of my job is putting together museum exhibitions. So when you go to a museum and you walk around and you see text on the wall, you see labels, you see text near objects, museum curators generally are the ones who are writing all of that text and putting together the exhibition and the exhibition narrative. So thinking through all the stories that the exhibition can tell. It involves selecting which objects should go on exhibit. And there's also a lot of behind the scenes labor that happens, right? So museum curators are often involved in doing research on objects in the collection. They give advice on whether or not objects should be either accepted as donations or purchased for the museum collection. And museum curators often write exhibition catalogs and write for other types of texts, right, like blog posts, and they often provide sort of the content expertise and research for a variety of programs and other exhibitions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially that last part is, I think, like a really helpful thing is like expertise and authority, which is like a massive part, to me at least, of like what we talk about all the time between education and curatorship. So does that work tend to be solo or as a team? And do you think that work at the APS is different at all?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on which museum you work at, right? But at the APS, it's a lot of teamwork. But at most museums, I'd say the exhibition planning is actually relies a lot on teamwork, right? Because you have to work with the museum educators to make sure that the stories we're telling are appropriate for our audiences. And that's going to work, at every museum, you have to work with museum educators. You have to work with collections managers who help, care for the objects. We work with the conservators. So we work with them so that they can tell us the safest way to put objects on display and whether or not it's safe for objects to even go on display because some objects are too fragile. And we work with designers, right? So people who have to actually help us pick out paint colors and design cases and design sort of mounts to hold the objects. So that is a lot of teamwork. I also worked very closely with the co-curator for the exhibitions at the APS Museum. And so that, obviously is a lot of teamwork when there's two curators who work together to write all the text and prepare all of the exhibition objects. But there's also a lot of solo work involved. So there's a lot of the research and writing is, totally independent. So this is kind of the best of both worlds situation. And then I get to really immerse myself in research and writing by myself, but then work with a team to really put something together. And that's going to be the case, I think, actually at a lot of museums. It's just the level of teamwork will vary.
Yeah, I think that massive listing of who you work with and how is really helpful, because there's something about Curator that sounds like a solo job, but it really is not a solo job. There's some weird misperception there that I don't know what it is, but it's highly collaborative.
Yes.
So how long have you been with the APS?
I've been at the APS now for almost 2 years. Yeah.
Wild to think about. And you listed out some things that you've done before the APS, but what did you do directly before it?
So right before coming to the APS, I was finishing up my dissertation in grad school. So I graduated and finished my dissertation in the spring of 2018, right before I started at the American Philosophical Society. So while I was in grad school, I was working on a dissertation. Essentially, if you're not familiar with that term, it's like a book-length research paper, right? So it's really like a book or a first draft of a book. And I researched colonial portraiture. So I was working on that project. As a grad student, I also taught classes at William and Mary and worked when I could at other museums.
And I think it's okay to do a shameless plug here, and I'll be able to share the link afterwards, but Jenni did help create a massive website of colonial Virginia portraits, which is fantastic. You can actually search by dogs in portraits even if you want. So it's great, and I think it's a good hybrid of highly scholarly work mixed with a good public aim at the end. That's fun. And how did you learn about or first hear about this field of work?
Yeah, so I have always loved visiting museums and historic sites. That's my mother's fault for taking us on family vacations to historic sites and museums as a kid. But it wasn't really until college when I realized that you could actually work at a museum, if that makes sense. As a kid, I never really thought about the people who worked at museums or that you can make a career out of it. So I started in college. I started as a history major, and then I eventually became an art history double major, and they offer a museum studies certification program in conjunction with art history. And it was once I started studying art history that I realized, hey, I could pursue a career in museums. And so that's sort of how I decided that's actually what I really wanted to do.
That's so, and it's so cool to hear that, and then also hear you go through the floodgates of the other jobs that are aligned with museums. I often tell people that every single thing that you see in a museum, there's probably a job or a person behind that. And think about those all as careers, down to the color choices on the walls, which is always a wild conversation to have. But it's so great. There are careers that go along with these things. You might not think about it until college, which is not too late to think about them.
Yeah.
So for being a curator, what are the education and kind of experience expectations for that job?
So generally, you're going to need at least a master's degree in a specialized topic to be a curator. Often PhDs are preferred, especially I think in larger museums. So you have to go to grad school if you want to be a curator, because curators do a lot of original research and writing. And so graduate degrees train you to do that work. And if you can get your graduate degree, you've already proven that you can do some long-term original research and intensive writing. So depending on what type of museum you want to work at, right, a lot of curators have graduate degrees in history, in art history, anthropology, or an American Studies degree like mine, which is interdisciplinary. So I sort of combined history and art history studies. And you should also just have experiences working at a museum before you'll get a good curatorial job.
Yeah, and I think, and I might be wrong on this, but I think curator is one of the ones that has the least flexibility in you should really have a higher education degree. That one, because the research that you do and how you do that so quickly and efficiently is not a skill set that I think most people have. So at least having that definitely goes along with the higher education degrees, but it's wildly helpful to have, I think. Everybody's kind of like least favorite question. What are the pros and cons of a job like a curator?
Yeah, I'll start with the cons first. We can end on a high note. So the con is it's a really tough field to break into, right? The job market's super competitive. A lot of people will stay in curatorial jobs forever, and so there's not high turnover. It's not always a very high-paying job, and you have to go to grad school, right? And so that's not necessarily a con if you like school and you like doing research, like I do. But grad school is a lot of work, and master's degrees, typically take like 1 to 2 years, but PhDs take an average of maybe 7. And so it's a lot of time and effort to get that degree and to try to break into the job market. And so that's probably the biggest con, is it's very competitive. The pro, though, and the good thing is that because it's so competitive, the people who stick with it are really passionate about what they do. And so you get to meet some really great people who are devoted to their research, to their work. They do a lot of interesting research. And you get to, work with great objects. Like, that's my favorite part of my job, is getting to engage with objects on a regular basis and do object-based research. And you get to travel to do that research and to present research. So there's a lot of pros as well.
It's always good to have a balance, or a strong balance there. But I think that there are a couple of things that you mentioned that I really do enjoy as being massively helpful and clear kind of through lines for a lot of these conversations is the low turnover, especially in a career like a curator. They're like, somebody gets that position, they stay with that for a while. So that's a great thing to think about. And I do like that the people always come up as a pro. like museum, library, archive people are all like a certain type, and within each job there's another certain type, and it's great to figure out what they all are, but also like who breaks molds, who doesn't fit into molds. We're all like unique individuals, but like we're all kind of like a certain type of nerd that works in a subset, which is so great to have. And then because I think you are the first one that I'm interviewing with this, do you have any kind of major points on like things to know before getting a PhD? It's a curveball question.
Yeah, so a PhD, you need to research, you need to know what you want to study, because you're going to devote like 5 to 7 years of your life studying it. So you have to like what you do. You need to, research universities that offer a graduate degree in whatever it is you want to focus on. If you want to say focus on early American history, right? William and Mary, where I went, that's why I'm using it as an example, is a great place to be because the professors there's a lot of them who specialize in early American history. So you want to figure out what you want to study. You want to figure out who's working at different universities, because once you enter grad school, you have an advisor that you work very closely with and who sort of oversees your research. And so you want to start narrowing down what professors are out there that you might want to work with if you go to grad school there. And you need to search for funding. Almost all PhD programs should be funding their students. It's not a lot of money. It's like often barely living wage, but you get a stipend in exchange for teaching or TAing and working for the university in various capacities. And so those are sort of the big things to really think about when you are trying to decide where to go to grad school, right? Who you want to work with, what the program specializes in, and the funding that's available.
The big three. Nice. Thank you for rolling with that random punch / slide question. This is also the point where we kind of like switch gears a little bit and talk a bit about past Janine. So what were you like in high school?
Yeah, so I was kind of a nerd because I loved going to school. But I went to a small all-girls school, so it's sort of a different dynamic. But I took a lot of AP classes, got straight A's except in gym. I did not get an A in gym class. But I know. not surprising, it cost me top spot in the class, but so I really liked going to school. I liked the research and writing classes. I was involved with theater, but I did all the tech work. I was involved with, sound and lighting and, backstage work, because I loved being part of the theater community, but I didn't necessarily want to be in the spotlight. So that was me, nerdy, straight A student.
And is this what nerdy, straight A, gym class hating Jenni thought she would be doing when she was in high school?
In high school, no, because it honestly didn't really occur to me that I could even really work in a museum, right?
Mm-hmm.
I actually thought for a long time I'd probably be a teacher, because I have a lot of teachers in my family.
Right, it always helps to have that example and like those kind of known careers. So what were you like in undergrad?
As an undergrad, so I went to a huge Big Ten school at Michigan State. So I still really enjoyed going to classes, and I was in the honors college. So I had a lot of flexibility in what classes I could take. So I was still nerdy, but I also had a lot of fun. Went to football games and was just, really social. But I was involved with the Undergraduate sort of Museum Studies Association very early on, and volunteered whenever I could for events at the Michigan State University Museum, at the Art Museum on campus, and try to stay involved and network with people in the Michigan museum community.
That's awesome. And it's fun to know like that slight switch, right, of like nerdy high school student into like Big Ten school. Like football game going, which is like so different in some way, but like very similar. And also within that is a great tip. Like usually universities either have museums attached or are in neighborhoods with museums. So always looking out for those and volunteering with those is a great like side tip too. And your major, you said, was history, and then you got museum studies certificate along the way, right?
Yeah, so I started as a history major. I always loved history, so I sort of started with that. And then I took an art history course as like an elective, right? I could just pick any sort of arts and humanities course I wanted to take, and absolutely and completely fell in love with it. And so I ended up declaring a double major because I had space in my sort of schedule to do a double major because I had all those AP classes from when I was a nerdy high school student. So
comes in hand.
Yep. So then I double majored in history and art history and did the museum studies certification program.
And so I think according to your previous stories too, is this what you thought you'd be doing when you were an undergrad?
It's what I hoped I'd be doing. Yeah. So it was one of those things where for the museum studies certificate program, you had to take a variety of classes. So early on I was taking museum education classes, sort of exhibition design classes, etc. And I took a curatorial practices class, and that was like by far my favorite museum studies class. And so early on I knew probably by junior year, I was like, oh, I want to be a curator. I liked the research component, I liked the writing component, and that's like, I knew that's what I wanted to be doing and wanted to continue working with objects in that way. And so I hoped I could do that. But like I said, I already knew that it was a tough field to break into. And so sort of like, I didn't know if I could actually do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is one of the truly major cons of this whole field is just the limited number of jobs that exist anyway. So within those kind of classes and within that class of curatorial practice, what was your aha moment with this career trajectory?
So it was when I think I was taking that curatorial methods course, just having to select what objects would go in the exhibit. It was like a class curated exhibition at the art museum on campus. And that was just so much fun to me to be able to be like, wow, we can tell our own stories with these objects. We can actually write the labels and do this intensive research. So that for me was probably like the aha moment. It was because I had had a lot of fun in museum education courses. I had an internship in museum education working with kids, but I just didn't love it the same way. It was, yeah.
And within what you said too, I think it's such a clear kind of like thing of if you're going to like curatorship, you should use the word fun to describe object choices, yeah, writing, and research. Double check those things.
You should get enjoyment out of like digging through stacks of archival documents that you can barely read to find the one sentence that proves something that you're looking for. Yeah, if you find that fun, then the curator is a good job.
Good track for you. So say and this is kind of where we switch back into the career education stuff. So if I were a student doing an informational interview with you about being a curator, what questions do you love being asked? Are there any questions that I should avoid? Do you have any sort of like email pet peeves?
Yeah, so I think I love being asked like what my favorite objects are in the collection. I think most curators kind of love that question. Or sort of what exhibition I'm working on or what research I'm most proud of. I think we love talking about objects, at least I do, and enjoy the opportunity to talk about our research. And then if you ask a question like that, you'll also get a sense of, what the collections are at the museum that you're interested in, and sort of the stories that the curators there are interested in telling. So I think that can be really useful. I also think it's a good idea if you're a high schooler or an undergrad, right? And if you're trying to decide what major to pursue or what graduate school options there are, ask people for their advice on what programs to look into, maybe what school they went to, if they have advice, right? Because different people will major or have degrees in different things. So you can sort of ask them for their advice, right? Should you get an art history degree? Should you get a history degree? What should you specialize in? Those are always good questions to ask. As for email, like pet peeves and things, if you're going to email someone, look up their title online. And if they have a PhD, you should, at least the first time you write to them, address them with their title, which is doctor, especially if they're a woman. And I say that just because PhDs are a lot of work. And often women don't get the respect that sort of comes with professional titles. And so you should always err on the side of formality. And, don't address them by their first name unless they tell you to, or unless they sort of sign off on their first name when they get back to you. I just think it's a nice way to show sort of respect and like awareness of how much effort they've put into their work. And it's professional, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go with a formal greeting at first.
Thank you for bringing it up, not for like only viewers of this, but also for myself, because like even in museum careers, no matter which one you go into, odds are you're going to cold email a curator at some point in time in your life, or like somebody with a doctorate degree, and it's so like good to know that like just go with formality in the first place. Mm-hmm. And doctor is a non-gendered term. It's easy to use. It's just 3 kind of like types, DR period. You're good to go. It's a safe bet. So it's good to know to like run with that anyway, because it is a sign of respect. If you're emailing somebody for an informational interview, respect should be like at the top of your priority list too. So awesome. Also, great point about like asking about objects and their current research, because that tells you other projects that are going on. But also, I love that like what stories they tell, because each curator is different. Each curator's perspective is different, and they will tell different stories about different objects or the same objects. So that was helpful to kind of get a good insight into what they're thinking about currently. Tip.
Yeah.
So how do you see the field of curatorship changing in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I know. I think the number one thing the field has to do and is doing is it has to get more diverse. Traditionally, it's been curators have been white and European background, and more and more people realize that not all curators should be white. We need more inclusive representation in museums, because that's just the only way you're going to get inclusive perspectives when you put exhibitions together. And especially with the history of museum collecting, right? It's very sort of imperial, Europeans and Americans collecting objects from all over the world. It's really important to bring in more sort of diverse perspectives to tell stories about these collections. And so it is changing. It changes a little bit slow, but I think people are very aware that pushing for a more diverse field is incredibly important. Curators also need to engage more and more with the community. I think it used to be very much like the museum curator worked alone, did research alone, wrote alone, was the content expert who never came down to talk to the public and just worked behind the scenes.
Right, and that's where that like alone, like solo work idea kind of comes from, right? Yeah.
But more and more, I think curators need to engage with the community because we need to understand who our audiences are more than ever. Audiences won't come to museums if they can't connect with the exhibitions that are being put on. So we need to understand the community, and there's so many contemporary issues that museum exhibitions can speak to. And so as curators, it's important to get sort of the community involved in the museum and get them invested in the museum. And so I think curators are becoming more and more public facing more than they have been traditionally. So I think that's really important. And I think experimenting with the digital is also really important. I mean, these days, well, during stay-at-home orders, right, everyone's going digital. But even before then, I think curators are so used to working with physical objects, and we should be. That's how we're trained, and like that's sort of the heart of the museum collection, right, are the objects. But more and more, I think engaging the community involves a global community and reaching people digitally. And so learning and thinking about how we can present object-based research digitally is actually really important.
Yeah, so much within that is so crucial, I think. And I always find it interesting too that I think like some aspects of museum work are slightly slower to change based on the systems that are kind of built into them. And the message of representation and diversity within museums is a slightly newer one given the history of museums, I'll say. And curators needing to have essentially a PhD, it's going to be even slower. So even if you want to be a curator and you're starting out now, that's still 8 years from now. So like knowing representation matters early on is so crucial. And even if you don't end up being a curator, representation within academia writ large is also massively important. Side note there. And communities, yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's like what every educator like kind of like pushes for, is that representation not only in the staff but also in the messages that the museum is pushing out are so crucial, especially now. So thank you for those responses. And as you love objects, as you say, I'll share my screen and bring up your favorite object from the APS collections, and you can talk a little bit more about that and its connection to your work as well. Okay, and there she is.
Yes, the portrait of Deborah Franklin. I had trouble picking like one object for this, but I went with Deborah because one of my goals as a curator, and anywhere I end up, any exhibition I ever want to work on, one of my goals will always be to tell stories about people who are historically marginalized or underrepresented, right? And so this exhibition I've been working on for like the past year or so has been about Benjamin Franklin, okay? Everyone knows Benjamin Franklin, right? You can recognize his face anywhere. I mean, globally, people recognize this man. So, you know, it's easy to tell his story, right? There's so much out there. But in contrast, his poor wife, Deborah, had, you know, like one portrait of her done, right? Nobody would recognize her, you know, if her statue went up on the street, right? Whereas Franklin is internationally recognized. Poor Deborah had one portrait of her that survives. And I wanted to be able to tell her story, but I didn't want it to just be like, oh, and here's Deborah, his wife, because that's not a really good story. And that's not really fair to Deborah either. And so this is such a great object, and it was a great exhibition to work on. It's about Benjamin Franklin and science. And so the questions I had to ask along with my co-curator were, what can we learn about Deborah? What can we learn about Deborah that has anything to do with science? And what can we say about her and her contributions to Dr. Benjamin Franklin's science? And tell her story in an interesting way that does her justice, right? As beyond sort of just the wife and mother, which, while incredibly important roles, is just a very basic summary of all the incredible hard work she did. And so I love this portrait of her because we were able to tell a story about how this portrait You know, it hung in her home. A copy of it hung in Franklin's London home, showing how much he cared about her. She became, every time he left Philadelphia, she ran the post office, ran the store, ran his printing press, sent him mail, sent him specimens, hosted all of his friends, sent news between him and his colleagues in Philadelphia. She even sent him specimens sometimes. So she'd send seeds between like him and Bartram, his friend from Philadelphia, but also would send him other types of objects for him to study while he was in London. And so we dug deep into her story. So when we put her portrait on the wall and we're writing about Deborah in the label to accompany it, we could tell a much more interesting story about Deborah's contributions to science and to Benjamin Franklin's life. And so I also love this because there's like 100 portraits of Franklin in the APS collection. That might be an under-exaggeration, I don't know, but it's so great to be able to tell women's stories too. And so it's just a great number to think about. Oh, we have hundreds of portraits of Benjamin, but one portrait of Deborah, which is such a great sort of metaphor for how we think, how women's history in America has been told, right? We have all these stories about these men and much fewer objects left behind from women. And so we have to work a little harder to tell their stories, but it's also way more rewarding when we find those stories because we've worked harder to find them, but we get to tell these stories that haven't been told before. And so I love her portrait. I love that we get to give her some, respectful presence in the exhibition gallery and tell her story. But I also chose this because I could have picked other objects in the exhibition that have to do with Deborah, that have to do with the women, that have to do with, enslaved people in the Franklin household or Native Americans in the Philadelphia area. But I, above all, love portraiture. It's what I do my personal research on. It's what I wrote my dissertation on. And so I wanted to show a portrait and talk about a portrait.
And it's such a great portrait. And it's so true what you said about, yeah, like we have all these portraits of Franklin. So like showing one compared to showing the Deborah portrait, which is one, rare, two, one of my now like favorite historical figures of all time, probably because of all the research that's been uncovered and like being done on her. Like, why not showcase that instead of another portrait of Franklin, which we love Franklin, by the way, everybody, fine, but Deborah's just a little bit cooler right now to us. And it's so great to know that like from a portrait you can go off into all these other topics, right? Which is a beautiful point to have as well. What a great note to end on. Bring it all together with diversity, representation, and stories about objects. So it's a great note. So thank you so much, Jenni, for being on Career Chats today. I think I loved everything about it. We work across the hall usually when we're back in the office, so it's nice to hear a bit more about your kind of background on everything as well. And the important message is, it's important also for your notes of representation in communities, so thank you. And remember to check out Career Chat's page for more information on who's up next. It'll be the final one in our series. We're interviewing Robert Hauser, or Bob Hauser as we all call him, the executive officer of the APS. It'll be a very exciting one. And thanks from me, the APS, and Jenni for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thanks.